Yesterday, we got a few big stories pertaining to Antifa, the far left, the Proud Boys. First, from the AP, 61 indicted in Georgia on racketeering charges connected to Stop Cop City movement. We also learned that the former leader of the Proud Boys, Enrique Tarrio, had been sentenced to 22 years in prison for his role in the insurrection on January 6th. The only problem, Enrique Tarrio wasn't actually there. According to the defense, he wasn't even in contact with anyone who was there during the events of January 6th. But apparently after the fact, he was cheering for them, celebrating what they were doing, and as such, he's the leader. He gets more than 2 decades in prison. It's very interesting. We're also learning in the past week that large payouts had been made to far left extremists for their rioting in Denver. And this is how the story goes. There's a fascinating way to view this if you look at the AP. Now, they do report that these far left extremists are being indicted on RICO charges, conspiracy charges. An additional 20 were charged with domestic terror. However, they point out something I think is very important. The Democrats have said they will not be involved in any prosecution against these individuals. Incredible. So while you have far left extremists in D.C., on January 20th, 2017, getting paid out millions of dollars. You have in Denver, far left extremists rioting. And these riots across the country resulted in 30 dead or whatever. They get paid out. When it comes to the indictments in Georgia, they say it's the Republican who is going after them and the Democrat refuses to be involved. At the same time, a guy who wasn't even at January 6th is getting 2 decades of his life taken away for statements he made about it to other people. The question comes up, civil war. And I think this is as good a time as ever to break down an honest and tempered discussion over what the media has been saying and as well as address things I've been saying in my view on everything that's going on. Perhaps a little bit cliche. It's a meme. I bring up civil war. But I think it's important to point out on any given day, if you are reading the news and actively paying attention, there are dozens of stories from corporate press outlets discussing what they view as the probability of a civil war. Many of these outlets say, no, you're overreacting. It can't happen. And they take this interesting view where they say that not enough people want to fight and the states could not split. The problem, when you look at the actual scholars, when you look at the people actually tracking the conflict, they say something quite different. They say, from a national security perspective, there is a decent probability of a civil war erupting. When you take a look at a former CIA analyst, or whatever her position was, I think she's, and there's a woman, her name is Barbara F. Walters. I think, funny, Barbara Walters. She says that we're tracking, like many other countries, towards a civil war. You have a Princeton professor saying it's a cold civil war. You have Stephen Marsh, who I've interviewed, saying we are in the civil strife period pre-Civil War. And you take a look at where we are today, and it is funny to me that so many people try to deny it, particularly on the left. People who would say that the Proud Boys and Donald Trump tried to overthrow the U.S. government. Well, let's just start here. If that is truly what you believe with January 6th, and Donald Trump is actually, as of today, the favorite to win the 2024 election, you don't think we're on the verge of any kind of serious conflict? Now, by all means, I welcome anyone to prove this wrong because I don't know exactly what's going to happen. And I would much prefer to complain about celebrities saying stupid political things. Oh, there goes guy from Marvel movie again, complaining about the president. Let's go back to when we had substantive arguments on policy and not to when we were seeing mass violence and acts of domestic terrorism. Now, the Democrats are refusing to prosecute Stop Cop City. You see how this is breaking down. In Georgia, the Republican goes after the far left, as he rightly should, because they were firebombing buildings and attacking cops. There was a shootout with police. The cops shot and killed a guy. Yeah, you probably should indict these extremists. But then you have in Fulton County, they go after the current front runner for the Republican Party. I'm sorry, guys. It's hard for me to take anyone seriously. You don't have to live in a world of panic and fear or anything like that. And I don't think you should. There's a potential off ramp, I suppose, in, Donald Trump gets elected and then we see weeding out of corruption. The far left extremists get stamped out and then people carry on with their lives. But considering the international conflict, considering what's going on with Ukraine and Russia and where we're headed, I don't understand why people would take the perspective that we are headed towards, I don't know, a calm. This is not pessimistic. And it really, really frustrates me when people just say, it's too black-pilled. I refuse to believe it. Yo, I don't care. Okay. I have these stories pulled up for you. Let's read through them. You take whatever assessment you want. But I tell you this, a lot of people have told me that they just can't stand politics because it's too depressing and it's too negative. Fact, humans tend to prefer negative news stories. Why? Well, it's simple. Someone comes and tells you that everything's going to be fine, don't worry about it, then what's the point of paying attention? You're like, well, I'm going to get back to work and do my thing. Someone comes and tells you a raging fire is heading your way, you want to know about it. But there are many people who don't want to know about it anymore because, well, it's depressing, I guess. What do you do? How do you handle it? I don't know what to tell you, man. You know, I'd much prefer to make a video about Starfield or Baldur's Gate, which we talked about a little bit last night. Video games, for those that don't know, and the political controversy around pronouns. Sure, I'll maybe talk about that later today. But this is serious stuff. When you have the breakdown in politics where a Democrat outright says, we will not prosecute people who burn down homes, they won't do it. And leftist media attacks or frames it as though it's the Republican targeting these peaceful protesters. You end up with people like Enrique Tarrio, who wasn't even at the Capitol, or he wasn't even in D.C. on January 6th, being sentenced to 22 years. Something before you is happening. I think it's fascinating to see many of these leftists. One of the reasons I think many on the left have to eschew the idea of civil war is that there's no civil war if there's no conflict between factions. Then it's just a communist revolution. And as far as we're seeing right now, in many ways, the left has an edge in terms of the overt use of force, and they have for some time. Obviously, when they riot, burn down buildings across the country, 30 plus people die, and they get paid, they've got a force advantage. However, culturally, when it comes to the big ones, Bud Light, Richmond, North of Richmond, Target, Sound of Freedom, we can see that the left is losing the culture war. Now, it is imperative that they downplay the idea of any conflict emerging, and they keep telling you what's happening is actually normal and you should accept it. Certainly, no one should be violent. That is the path to defeat. What we need is a political and cultural victory, which we are on track for, as I mentioned. Donald Trump is currently the favorite. In the polls, he's rivaling Joe Biden. In swing states, according to a few of the polls, he's beating Joe Biden. And Joe Biden's favorability is in the gutter. Kamala Harris is apparently saying she's ready to take over the moment Joe Biden can't do it. We'll see how this plays out. I insist that all of you remain optimistic. Conflict happens in this country all the time, and it has always been there, whether it's international or domestic. There is some kind of conflict. Now, perhaps it may be, especially in my experience, more people are saying that they've never seen it this bad. That doesn't mean things are going to devolve into abject chaos and that there's going to be a fracturing of the states or anything like that. But it certainly means that you should pay attention to what's going on and keep it in the back of your mind. Live your life, resist where you can, make money, protect your family, support cultural endeavors that benefit American values, put your money in programs that benefit American values, download the app Public Square, and just pay attention to what's going on. So in the event the fires start raging in your area, you can calmly and leisurely stroll to however it is you plan to protect yourself. I hope that in the coming year, all of this simmers down, and that may be the case. But let me go through many of these stories and break down for you what brings me to my current position. And I think one of the challenges with the idea of civil war in the United States is that there is so much information to absorb and consider. Plus, people can't see the forest when they're in the middle of it. I think a refresher would benefit many of you. And I think it requires a stoic, pragmatic, and calm mind to genuinely assess what's going on. Many people don't like to hear it. It's bad. It's shocking. It's scary. Our optimism bias and our normalcy bias tells us none of this could ever happen. But as I often say, take the time travel test. Go back in time 6 years and tell yourself or anyone in the United States that, say, in 6 years, the leader of the Proud Boys, and several of them, will be sentenced to nearly 2 decades or more in prison by the government for terrorism charges related to trying to overthrow the U.S. government, and they will laugh in your face. Say Donald Trump will be accused of staging an insurrection to steal power. They will laugh in your face. That 48 states would be involved in a lawsuit to the Supreme Court to stop the 2020 election or to challenge it, at the very least, Texas v. Pennsylvania. That happened. Accusations of widespread voter fraud. People won't believe you. They just wouldn't believe you. I know this because I'm currently living it. And I ask people to just consider where we are today and how far you think we've come. But let's take a look at this news, and we'll go back in time to 2017, and we'll actually ask this question from then till now, 6 years ago. First, this is a story from the AP, and I think it's important to break down. They say 61 indicted in Georgia on racketeering charges connected to Stop Cop City. The fascinating thing is, take a look at this. The Stop Cop City effort has gone on for more than 2 years, and at times has veered into vandalism and violence. Is that what you call shooting at police, burning down homes, tearing people from their vehicles, flipping it over and setting it on fire? Yeah, I call that terrorism. Opponents fear the training center will lead to greater militarization of the police, and that its construction in an urban forest will exacerbate environmental damage in a poor majority black area. Interesting. When they talk about January 6th, what do they say? Far-right extremists, egged on by Donald Trump. You get it. There is clearly a corporate narrative. Interestingly, what I think is actually worrisome here is that they're saying it's the Republicans doing it. And this paragraph I think is important. They say the Law Center, SPLC, you all know the SPLC, they're upset that one of their lawyers was actually charged with domestic terrorism. They called it an example of heavy-handed law enforcement. DeKalb County District Attorney Sherry Boston, a Democrat, mentioned her concerns about Juergens' prosecution in announcing her June decision to withdraw from criminal cases connected to the movement, citing disagreements with Carr over how to handle the matters. Let's put it simply. 100+ far-left extremists stormed government property. It has been an ongoing occupation. Again, a shootout occurred with the police. A cop was shot. They returned fire, killing one of the extremists. Would anyone believe you if you told them this 6-7 years ago? That there would be 100+ extremists occupying federal grounds, firebombing police, burning down houses, shooting at cops. A cop shoots and kills one of them. They'd be like, get out of here. Would they have believed the Chaz or the Chop? It's increments. Don't let the incremental nature of how these things come to be make you ignore the changes that we've experienced. More importantly, everything I've just said, and the Democrat says outright, we will not be involved in these criminal cases. Are you kidding? The Democrat is going to walk away from what these terrorists are doing? It's partisanship outright. Of course, as I mentioned, Enrique Tarrio, he gets 22 years. Why? Well, look, it doesn't matter what you think. It really doesn't. It matters that you know the truth. Enrique Tarrio was not there. The reason for the 22 years is because he egged on Proud Boys, according to the judge and the prosecution. The defense said he wasn't even in contact with any of the Proud Boys that day. But apparently he said things like, don't leave, and compared some of these individuals that were there to the founding fathers. And that's enough. Now, I'm sure Enrique Tarrio thought this was protected speech. What does don't leave refer to? Honestly, we don't know. If you're on the left, you're going to say he was organizing and telling everyone what to do. I think that's a load of hogwash. These guys didn't have any plans. They were unarmed and they were doofing about like idiots. But, this is what happens with a Democrat administration targeting their political opponents as these things escalate. I'm curious about the quote, don't leave. Was he referring to before the storming of the Capitol? Was it after? That context matters. And we don't know for sure. I don't. I wasn't at the criminal trial. But you know what? If they did organize and they did do these things, fine, so be it. However, I think for the riot we saw at the Capitol, what's justified? A couple years maybe for pulling down barricades, fighting with cops, pepper spraying them, smashing windows. Bad stuff. And particularly offensive if you did it at the nation's capital. Don't get me wrong. Right? I think that's horrible what these people did. And I've long said, yeah, criminal charges. But what is that? 16 months? You rioted at the Capitol. The cops pushed you back. It was particularly bad. Maybe if we want to be extreme, 3 years. Nobody killed anybody. They smashed windows. A couple years, maybe. What are we seeing? You take a look at these people in Georgia, and the Democrat says, I'm not going to charge them at all. I'm not going to be involved. You take a look at January 6th. There are dozens, if not hundreds of people who did not riot, who did not storm the Capitol, but who bumbled about after a speech by Donald Trump with no idea what was going on, walked up to a building where there were no barricades. They'd been torn down. No signs. Police actually waving people in. That's a fact. Look it up. One guy was acquitted outright because there's a video of the cop waving him, come on in. There's a video of the police opening the door saying, don't agree with it, but I respect it. Police officers taking selfies with people. How could any of these people, and I'm not talking about the violent rioters, I'm talking about the people who were just walking down the street and saw people going to the Capitol grounds, which typically is open to the public. They didn't even know they were trespassing. And some of these people are being sentenced to a year plus. Some of these people got a few months if they pleaded guilty and just admitted fault. Some of them have already got out. The shaman, of course, you know him. He's out. There's a clear bias in how things are going down. But let's advance, my friends. Rob Reiner, you know him, you love him. He said the leader of the Proud Boys was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison for violently storming the U.S. Capitol in an attempt to overthrow the government. He never would have been at the Capitol had it not been for Donald Trump. You do the math. Okay. Enrique Tarrio wasn't there. He's lying. Either Rob Reiner is maliciously evil or he's the banality of evil. But I think Rob Reiner is maliciously evil. I think he knows exactly that it's not true. How would he have heard about this otherwise? If you look at any of the headlines, they mention, for the most part, they say, well, to be fair, the New York Times doesn't. Let's see, that he was central to the role. They say central to the role, blah, 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 stemming from his conviction, most severe, and like until now, the longest prison sentence. To be fair, they don't actually go in until, look at this. Of all the sentences, it was most notable because what it suggests about the state of the Proud Boys, they don't actually mention anywhere in the beginning. He wasn't even there. He wasn't even there. But I think Rob Reiner, he's active. He knows. A community note was added saying, while Enrique was sentenced to 22 years in prison, it was not for violently storming the Capitol, as ABC correctly reports Tarrio wasn't present in Washington on the day of the attack. Take for it what you will. And then I will bring you all back in time. From the New Yorker. I've referenced this periodically over the past several years. It was the introduction into the foray of, are we headed towards some kind of civil war? August 14th, 2017. The New Yorker writes, is America headed for a new kind of civil war? The first time the question was posed that I remember seeing it. Go back 6 years and take a look at Charlottesville. What did anyone say about what was going on? Well, the consensus was, what a ridiculous fear-mongering article, and it's a waste of time to talk about. None of this will escalate. You've got just political crackpots fighting in the streets, and it will never reach the highest levels of government. About that. Now we know that Hunter Biden, there's whistleblowers coming out saying that they were informed about what was going on. The DOJ knew, and they're giving special treatment to Hunter. We know that we know that Joe Biden ordered the AG to go after Donald Trump. The front runner for the Republican nomination has been indicted, 94 times. They're insane charges. They've indicted his lawyers for simply providing him legal counsel. I'm talking about Jenna Ellis. You want to make arguments about literally anybody else? Fine. Rudy Giuliani and his crazy arguments. I still disagree. I think legal representation is protected. But Jenna Ellis? She's indictments 1 and 2, counts 1 and 2 of the indictment, RICO, and soliciting a violation of the oath of public office or whatever. Why? Because she was a lawyer. Insane. You take a look at what they're doing with Enrique Tarrio. 22 years, he wasn't even there. You take a look at the Democrats refusing to prosecute. You take a look at them paying out far left extremists. Oh, I got those stories coming up for you. And you ask me, would anyone have believed we'd be at this point where at the highest levels of government, the president is ordering the arrest of his rival and they don't care? Sure, fine. Please convince me that this all just simmers down. I don't know that civil war is what happens. These are the articles that emerged. Let's go back in time. A day after the brawling and racist brutality and deaths in Virginia, Governor Terry McAuliffe asked, how did we get to this place? The more relevant question after Charlottesville and other deadly episodes in Ferguson, Charleston, Dallas, St. Paul, Baltimore, Baton Rouge, and Alexandria is where the United States is headed. How fragile is the Union, our republic, and a country that has long been considered the world's most stable democracy? The dangers are now bigger than the collective episodes of violence. The radical right wing was more successful in entering the political mainstream last year than in half a century. The Southern Poverty Law Center reported in February. Of course, this writer, Goes on to ask many national security experts who keep saying things like this could never happen. And at the time, this was Charlottesville. People thought, oh, come on. Is it really going to get worse than this? Probably not. I'd argue that it has. The Summer of Love riots, 30 plus dead. Now, it wasn't overtly political. It wasn't like people were marching in the streets. Oh, power flux. It wasn't like people were marching in the streets for a political cause. It was violence. It was rioting and things like that. But it did result in a lot of people dead. And it was the underlying cause was political. But I think a lot of rage pertaining to COVID. But let's come to the end of this because we got a lot to cover and hopefully the power doesn't go out. In the end, let me jump to the end because I think they talk a lot about what the FBI says we're going and yada, yada, yada. I think the general consensus they came to in this was that there's a 35 to 90% chance of something happening, a civil war breaking out. This article is from 2017. But let me advance. The Independent. 61 Stop Cop City activists face RICO charges in Georgia indictment. The state's Republican Attorney General is leading the prosecution. Sure. That's how the Independent will frame it. And they will, I don't know if they pointed out, but the Democrat is standing back. This will be the narrative. Moving forward, take a look at this. April 26, 2021. D.C. settles cases from protest arrests during Trump's inauguration. That's right. Far-left extremists, hundreds of them, stormed the city, smashed windows, set fires. The police arrested them, charged them with conspiracy. Not only were most of them acquitted, some of them did plead guilty. 6 cops were injured. The ACLU defended them, and they ended up winning. The District of Columbia will pay $1.6 million to settle 2 cases that stemmed from D.C. police's arrest of hundreds of demonstrators during Trump's inauguration. The protesters, some of whom were gathered under the umbrella group Disrupt J20, planned to disrupt the inauguration and adjacent events, such as the Deplorable. I was there at the Deplorable and at the riots. I saw the destruction these people waged. Then what? They got paid out. Perhaps you can argue the reason they got paid out was because we were not at that point. Now, if something like this were to happen, maybe they'll get domestic terror or RICO charges like we're seeing in Atlanta. Perhaps. All that means is escalation. But I don't think it's correct. Here's from the AP. As of August 28th, Denver to pay $4.7 million to settle claims it targeted George Floyd protesters for violating curfew. So you mean to tell me when the far left extremists go around smashing things in widespread protests, riots, the worst we've seen in 50 years, they get paid, baby. Incredible. Sure. I'll bring it back in time. 2019. So we go from 2017. We see these payouts. Now we have 2019. Princeton professor, we are in a cold civil war. A cold civil war. Wow. Bold claim. Princeton professor Eddie Glaude Jr., responding on Sunday to the shooting deaths of at least 20 people in El Paso, said the U.S. is in the midst of a cold civil war. What happens when we use language like infestation? You set the stage for people who are even more on the extreme to act violently. Now, you may think this guy is wrong. He says, we are in a cold civil war, and there are some people who bear the burden of it. Maybe you think he's nuts. Maybe you think he's wrong. But this was 4 years ago. I bring you back to an article over a year ago. This is actually almost 2 years now. This is from The Guardian. U.S. closer to civil war than most would like to believe, new book says. Maybe these people are all liars. Maybe they're all grifters. Fine. But how do you deal with these facts that we're seeing? 22 years in prison for Tario, 17 for Biggs, plus 2.5 already served. Several Proud Boys. What was it? Biggs got a terror charge because he tore a barricade down. Shouldn't have done it. It's bad. But 2 decades? Wow. The guy who burned down the police station in Minneapolis got 4 years. Joe Biden, staff members donated to bail these people out, and Kamala Harris directly solicited money to bail out these extremists. Fascinating. Barbara F. Walter, not Walter, is Walter, is a former member of a key CIA advisory panel, particularly on civil wars, political instability task force, political science professor at the University of California at San Diego, wrote a book basically saying that we are inching towards or on the verge of a civil war. The U.S. is closer to civil war than any of us would like to believe. The analysis by Barbara F. Walter, professor at university, I said this already, is contained in the book due out next year. Okay. Shock content made to sell a book. Fine, whatever. At this point, it's a meme, right? this professor. You've got this New Yorker article from 6 years ago. All of these people are simply writing shock content. Maybe the case. Maybe that's it. I am not someone who simply comes out and just says, hey, I think people fighting in the street means civil war. My view on this started with the article from the New Yorker outright saying that some national security experts think it's like 90+% chance based on what we're seeing. I have another article for you. A new book imagines a looming civil war over the very meaning of America. Journalist Stephen Marsh envisions multiple scenarios propelling the country into conflict. We interviewed Stephen Marsh. It was fascinating. We completely disagreed on matters of fact, and he's completely wrong about a lot because he lives in the world of the corporate narrative. He believes in the multicultural democracy, but one thing we both agreed on is that with these disparate views of the world, of the world views and what's happening in this country, it seems like we are entering a civil conflict. What you end up with is a multicultural democracy in the United States fighting with a constitutional republic. Perhaps those are the two parent factions. I believe in the constitutional republic. Stephen Marsh says he believes in the multicultural democracy. I told him, you realize the multicultural democracy seeks to subvert and supplant the existing constitutional republic. Thus, it is your worldview that is waging war on ours. Yep. And that really explains it. Those who believe in the constitutional republic are sitting back and saying we must adhere to the system, while the subversives are saying by any means necessary. We see this said a lot. I think Marianne Williamson said it. The old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. It's fascinating what that means. It is a creepy and disgusting worldview, but I don't completely agree. I think the old world has died, and there are two new worlds seeking to be born. The establishment machine is in shambles. That's the reality. Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders represent the two new visions. One, relying on our Constitution, our constitutional republic systems, but a dramatic change to how things have been operating for some time. More libertarian, more secular in a lot of ways, but respecting of tradition, not adhering to the way things had been over the past several decades with a political elite ruling over you. You then have the other new vision, which is a multicultural democracy. The establishment that controlled this country seems to have lost power, presumably being born of the Civil War or strengthened or born in 1913 with the creation of the Federal Reserve. It's hard to know for sure when it began. But there has been an establishment machine in this country for a long time, and it is dying. So it's interesting. I don't see it as the old world dying and the new world struggling to be born. It is the old world dying, and the children of the old world are fighting for who will be the dominant cultural force. For a lot of reasons, I think we win. It's not left and right. It's not socialist or capitalist. It really isn't. It is constitutional republic versus multicultural democracy. That is one component. Don't get me wrong. Libertarian versus authoritarian, capitalist, socialist. These things do play a role in this. And everyone's always trying to figure out, is it nationalist versus globalist? All of these things make up whether it is a constitutional republic waving an American flag or an entirely new multicultural democracy. That's why they keep saying our democracy. They're not talking about you when they say this. When the left says our democracy, they're referring to their tribe and their cult and those who adhere to it. They wave a new flag. They fly their new flag at government buildings. Yeah, it very much is happening. Now, look, in the long run, whatever it may be, I don't see a faction surviving if they sterilize their kids, abort their kids, and, that one's fairly obvious. They're losing the culture war. They're losing money. Bud Light is losing money. Netflix is losing money. Disney is losing money across the board. The attempts at their world don't make sense. And so the new constitutional republic-based system, I think, will succeed. And I do think it's a new system because it eschews the Republican Party for a new kind of leadership based on the Constitution and restoring our rights and our values. I'll give you an example of what I mean by this is not the old world. This is the new. You didn't have the right to keep and bear arms in this country for a long time, and you didn't have the right to free speech. George Carlin got arrested for obscenity because he was swearing on the radio. In the 80s, you couldn't even get a gun in this country. In 2008, we got DC versus Heller, and they said, you have the right to keep and bear arms. This is the emergence of a new view based on the Constitution. Even when the Bill of Rights came to be, I think it was 1789, you didn't have free speech. They said you did, but you could be arrested for blasphemy. You could be arrested for sedition. You could be arrested for obscenity. Our view of free speech has dramatically expanded and is very, very different to what once was 10 years ago. Take a look at the expansion of gun rights, massively expanding. We had the Second Amendment, yet they still passed the NFA, and they reformed it over and over again and banned weapons. And now, more states than ever are enacting constitutional carry. This is new, but it's based on our Constitution. A new world emerges before us. Here we go. The Washington Times. End Democrats starting a second civil war before it begins. Liberals persecute Trump and his advisors. This is from July 25th, 2023. They say roughly half of Republicans and over a third of Democrats believe our country is on the brink of a civil war. If such an unthinkable war breaks out, it will be the Democrats' fault, they say. Well, you see where we're going. I think I have a couple more. Here we go. The LA Times says, worried about another civil war? It's not imminent, but the narrative is out right there. I want to show you this from the Boston Globe, 2020, July 26, which ends by saying, The Intercept, a left-wing news outlet, at one point, giving an interview to The Intercept, saying, in the mock election, Trump sought to divide Democrats. At one point, giving an interview to The Intercept, saying Bernie Sanders would have won if Democrats had nominated him, perhaps. Meanwhile, Biden's team sought to encourage large Western states to secede unless pro-democracy reforms were made. Let me slow down. The context of this, a war game was held before the 2020 election as to what they would do in the event Trump won. It was held, they said bipartisan, but it was never Trump or Republicans and establishment Democrats. They basically played Dungeons and Dragons, but American politics, rolling die to see what would happen and things like that. In their scenario, in their view, the establishment thought it preferable that Western states secede from the Union. The Boston Globe reported this. I don't know that actually happens. I'm just saying the sentiment, the language, it is all there right before us. Where are we today? Street violence is worse than we've seen in a long time. And again, I always say, take the time travel test. No one will believe you. No one would have believed you if you go back to 2017 and discuss these ideas. And I know because this is what I got every time I brought this stuff up. So let me put it this way. First, it is fascinating to me that there are people on the left who say, here goes Tim Pool talking about civil war again. It's stupid. And I'm just like, I just laid out for you all of these articles. Google search it. There's hundreds, if not thousands of articles, all entertaining the same possibilities. Not something I made up. Never something I made up. I don't know exactly what happens. But I do think it's fascinating that there are people who are so blinded by the incremental changes we have seen over the past 6-7 years, they still act like nothing is happening. Maybe it's because they need to maintain that nothing is happening so that nobody says anything. One of the big stories right now is a new video game came out called Starfield that includes your ability to choose your pronouns. And the left is mocking those who are upset about it. In the game Baldur's Gate, not only can you choose, I don't think you can choose pronouns, but you can they have body types, 1, 2, 3, 4. It's like skinny male or female and fat male or female. And then you can choose an identity. So you can be a male-bodied person with a female face, a male voice, but identify as a woman. All of that is in these games. They are claiming that nothing is happening and there is no civil war and calm down, go to sleep, because if there is no cultural effort, if there is no activity from the right, it is simply a communist revolution. But if the right says no, and they play this game strategically and resist, well, then it's fifth generational civil conflict. I don't say civil war because it could be psychological. It could be Trump winning and then, it could just be civil strife. It may not ever escalate to the point of warring factions. But I'll say two things. The first, Stephen Marsh, he wrote the book. He says we are definitively in civil strife. This is like Bleeding Kansas. He says it outright. Civil strife is when I think more than 70 plus people are killed every year over politics. And he says we've been in this for actually some time and it's escalating. That's like the Bleeding Kansas phase, which happened 7 years before the Civil War. The other thing I want to mention, people often say, and I think, some of these articles that I pulled up actually bring this up. There's no appetite for civil war. Nobody's going to fight. Most people don't want to fight. And you see these things from people on Twitter. They're like, oh, Tim Pool's too online reading these articles. Most people don't care. I find it fascinating. I want you to imagine this. You are in, let's say you're in Atlanta in 1860. You walk outside and you look at your neighbor and you say, are you angry? No. Are you angry? No. Nobody wants to fight. Well, yeah, dude, you're in Atlanta. Everybody agrees with you. Today, it is mostly these leftists who walk out of their homes in their urban liberal centers and say, nobody here wants to fight over anything. We all agree on everything. Dude, are you kidding? MAGA country, you can see it pronounced between Oklahoma and Colorado. Oklahoma, who banned abortion outright, and Colorado, who removed all restrictions on abortion, even up to the point of birth. Those two worldviews do not coexist. I don't know what that leads to. I'm just saying. Perhaps the issue is when these people walk outside of their houses, they see nothing but people who agree with them and say, I don't see anybody wanting to have conflict. But when you look at the bigger picture, you see states that completely disagree to the point where there's real fear over what happens. Children being castrated and sterilized, kidnapped. States like Washington protecting the kidnappers. That's right. Washington says you can bring a child there and they will not prosecute you. That's horrifying. You cannot. And I don't know that abortion becomes the catalyst, but let me stress, you cannot exist in a country. And I see people on the right saying this is the way it should be. States should decide. Sure. You can't have a functioning country where states determine who gets human rights. It is partially what led to the first Civil War, the question of slavery, when some states said, these are human beings with civil rights, inalienable rights, and they cannot be owned. Another state saying, actually, they can be. Now, there's a lot more to the Civil War than just that. Don't get me wrong. A lot more. It's very complicated. But you take a look at where we are now. And whether or not abortion is the catalyst or politics, I honestly don't know. But you tell me how a country can exist when they guarantee human rights under the Bill of Rights, but cannot figure out who is human and who isn't. Right now, the question is, do unborn babies have human rights? Here's the problem. At 8 months gestation, that baby can survive on its own, easily. But Colorado says you can terminate its life. Why? Well, it's inside the body of another person. My question is, well, why not just remove the baby, but, alive and let it live? Colorado says that baby has no sovereign rights over its own life because it is covered by a layer of flesh of another person. Oklahoma says, no, that baby is alive. And Oklahoma actually says as soon as it's conceived, it's a human life. How can you enforce the law if you cannot determine who gets rights? What's fascinating is I went to the Outer Banks for Labor Day. It was really fun. They got wild horses running on the beaches. They say you can't get within 50 feet of them. The horse can go and do whatever they want. I thought it fascinating. Why is it that you can put up a no trespassing sign? The horses can jump right over the little barrier and do whatever they want. The horses are not subject to human law. And it was funny. My girlfriend was like, yeah, well, we're not subject to horse law. You know what I mean? Like the horses will set territory and be like, stay out of my, or like wolves will, and we don't abide by their laws. And I'm like, it's funny though. If someone has human rights, they also have human responsibilities. We determine that these horses are free to do whatever they want, and they're protected, actually. Think about it this way. One state says, this is a human. One state says, this is not a human. How does the Constitution apply to them if two states don't agree they're human? Again, I don't know that abortion becomes the catalyst for civil conflict. I'm just telling you outright, ladies and gentlemen, you have a nation that is divided as to whether or not the federal government, the federal law protects an individual. Oklahoma may have a federal court that says, this unborn life is protected under the 14th Amendment. It says human rights, blah, 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 despite not being born. Colorado's federal court then says, no, we disagree. You tell me that plays out, how that will play out. I don't know for sure. But I've gone long, so I'll wrap it up there. By all means, tell me I'm wrong. Please feel free to. Challenge these articles and explain why they're wrong, and I accept your argument. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm just letting you know these things are happening. What happens next? I can't see the future. Next segment's coming up at 1 p.m. on this channel. Thanks for hanging out, and I'll see you all then.